The date is July 4, 1942. It is Independence Day in the United States, a day of fireworks and celebration. But 3,000 miles away, in the freezing, slate-gray waters of the Barents Sea, there is no celebration. There is only a massacre in progress. Convoy PQ-17, a massive armada of 35 merchant ships loaded with tanks, aircraft, and ammunition destined for the Soviet Union, is steaming slowly through the Arctic fog. They are sitting ducks, but they are confident. They are protected by a massive escort of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. Then, the radio operators on the flagship receive a message from the British Admiralty in London. It is marked Most Immediate. It is a message that will go down in history as one of the most catastrophic errors of the Second World War. The message contains 3 words. Convoy is to scatter. The First Sea Lord in London, believing the terrified and ultimately incorrect intelligence reports that the mighty German battleship Tirpitz has put to sea to intercept the convoy, panics. He orders the protecting warships to withdraw at high speed to avoid a surface engagement. He orders the merchant ships to disperse and make their way to Russia individually without protection. It is a death sentence. The merchant captains watch in horror as their destroyers and cruisers turn around and steam away at 30 knots, disappearing into the mist. Abandoned by their escort, the slow, plodding Liberty ships and freighters are left naked under the midnight sun. For the next week, the German Luftwaffe and U-boat wolf packs hunt them down like sport. It is a slaughter. Heinkel bombers dive out of the sun, unopposed by anti-aircraft fire. U-boats surface and shell the helpless freighters at point-blank range, saving their torpedoes for harder targets. Of the 35 ships that set sail, only 11 survive. 24 ships are sent to the bottom. Along with them go 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, and 3,350 vehicles, enough equipment to arm an entire army group on the Eastern Front. The water is so cold that a sailor in a life jacket survives for less than 5 minutes before his heart stops. The screams of the dying are swallowed by the Arctic wind. This route, the run from Iceland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, was officially known as the Arctic Convoys. But the sailors who sailed it had a different name. They called it the Suicide Run. They called it the worst journey in the world. The disaster of PQ-17 seemed to prove that the blockade could not be broken. The Germans held all the cards: land-based air power in Norway, U-boat bases within striking distance, and the terrifying threat of their heavy surface ships. The logic of naval warfare suggested that sending slow ships through that gauntlet was madness.
Yet by the end of the war, the Allies had not abandoned the route. Instead, they had delivered over 4 million tons of cargo through those freezing waters. They delivered 7,000 aircraft, 5,000 tanks, and enough raw materials to keep the Soviet industrial machine running when it should have collapsed. But the question remains, how? How did the Allied navies recover from the humiliation of PQ-17? How did they turn a route of certain death into a highway of victory? And what was the specific tactical innovation, a change in mindset as much as machinery, that finally broke the back of the German blockade? To understand this miracle, we must first understand the arena. The Arctic Ocean is not like the Atlantic. It is not like the Pacific. It is a claustrophobic, frozen cage. To get supplies to the Soviet Union, Allied ships had to sail north of Norway. This forced them into a narrow corridor of water. To the south was the German-occupied coast of Norway, bristling with Luftwaffe airfields and submarine pens carved into the granite fjords. To the north was the permanent, impenetrable polar ice pack. The convoys were squeezed between the ice and the enemy. The environment itself was a weapon. In the summer, the sun never sets. It is perpetual daylight, meaning the convoys can be seen by German reconnaissance planes 24 hours a day. There is no cloak of darkness to hide in. You are visible naked and vulnerable for weeks on end. In the winter, the sun never rises. It is perpetual night, a world of terrifying storms, rogue waves 60 feet high, and darkness so absolute that ships often collided with each other because they couldn't see the vessel 500 yards ahead. But the true enemy was the cold. The temperature regularly dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. This created a phenomenon known as black frost. As the sea spray hit the superstructure of the ships, the railings, the wires, the gun barrels, it froze instantly. It didn't form white snow. It formed dense, heavy, clear ice. Layer upon layer of ice would build up on the decks. This was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. If the ice grew too thick, the ship would become top-heavy. The center of gravity would shift upwards. In a heavy swell, the ship would simply roll over and capsize, taking everyone down with it in seconds.
The sailors on these convoys fought two wars simultaneously. They fought the Germans and they fought the ice. Every day, men had to go out onto the heaving, slippery decks with axes, baseball bats, and steam hoses to chip away the ice. If they stopped chipping, they died. If they slipped and fell overboard, they died. And looming over all of this misery was the lonely Queen of the North, the German battleship Tirpitz. The Tirpitz was the sister ship to the Bismarck. She was the largest battleship ever built by a European navy, armed with massive 15-inch guns. She was stationed in the fjords of Norway, hiding in the deep cliffs like a wolf in a cave. She rarely put to sea, but she didn't have to. Her mere existence was a fleet in being. She forced the British Royal Navy to keep their capital ships close to home. The fear that the Tirpitz might come out and slaughter a convoy is exactly what caused the panic and disaster of PQ-17. After the massacre of July 1942, the convoys were halted. The British Admiralty said it was impossible to continue. The risk was too high. The loss of life was unsustainable. But politics does not care about risk. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin was furious. The Battle of Stalingrad was raging. The Soviet Union was bleeding to death. Stalin sent telegrams to Winston Churchill that bordered on insults. He accused the British Navy of cowardice. He demanded that the Second Front be opened. But until then, he demanded the supplies. Churchill knew that if the Soviet Union collapsed, Hitler would turn his entire force, millions of men, west against Britain. The convoys had to restart, but they couldn't restart using the old tactics. They needed a revolution. The old tactic was scattering. The theory was that if a convoy was attacked by a superior force, the ships should disperse like a flock of birds, making it harder for the enemy to catch them all. PQ-17 proved that scattering was suicide. It just allowed the wolves to pick off the sheep one by one. The new tactic was fighting through. The decision was made by Admiral John Tovey, the commander-in-chief of the home fleet. Tovey was a fighting sailor, a man who believed that the primary duty of the escort was not to save themselves, but to save the cargo. The doctrine of fighting through meant that no matter what came at the convoy, U-boats, bombers, or even the Tirpitz, the merchant ships would stay in a tight, disciplined formation. They would not break ranks. They would rely on a layered defense that turned the convoy into a floating fortress. This required a massive escalation in firepower. A convoy of 40 merchant ships would now be protected by a close escort of destroyers and corvettes that physically hugged the columns of cargo ships. Outside of that, a cruiser cover force would patrol the horizon to intercept German surface ships. And further out, unseen but present, the distant cover of battleships would wait for the Tirpitz.
But the key to making this work was a new type of ship, a vessel that was mocked by traditional naval officers, but which became the savior of the Arctic. It was the escort carrier. The Allies realized they could not protect the convoys without air cover. The Luftwaffe bases in Norway were too close. The Allied land-based fighters were too far away. There was a jagged hole in the air defense map known as the air gap. The solution was to bring the airfield to the ocean. The escort carrier, often called a jeep carrier or baby flat top, was not a mighty warship. It was usually a converted merchant hull, sometimes even a grain ship or an oil tanker, with a flat wooden deck bolted on top. It was slow, unarmored, and carried only a handful of planes. Pilots joked that their class designation, CVE, stood for Combustible, Vulnerable, Expendable. But when the convoys restarted in the winter of 1942, the presence of these little carriers changed the physics of the battle. They carried an airplane that looked like a joke, the Fairey Swordfish. The Swordfish was an archaic biplane made of canvas and wire. It looked like a relic from World War I. It had an open cockpit where the pilot would freeze in the Arctic air. It was so slow that it could almost hover in a strong headwind. The Germans laughed at it. But on the escort carriers, the Swordfish was a lethal weapon. Because it was slow, it could take off and land on a tiny pitching deck in rough seas that would have crashed a modern fighter. Because it was maneuverable, it could hunt U-boats in the fog. The U-boats had always relied on their invisibility. They would surface at night to recharge their batteries and race ahead of the convoy to set up an ambush. But now, the Swordfish were patrolling the darkness. A U-boat would surface, and suddenly a white flare would burst overhead, turning night into day, followed by the splash of rockets and depth charges. The hunters became the hunted. The test of the new fighting-through tactic came with the Battle of the Barents Sea in December 1942. Convoy JW-51B was slogging toward Russia. It was the dead of winter. The polar night was absolute. The convoy consisted of 14 merchant ships carrying 2,000 trucks, 200 tanks, and 120 aircraft. Waiting for them was a German surface fleet led by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and the pocket battleship Lützow. The Germans had overwhelming firepower. The Hipper alone had 8-inch guns that could pulverize the British destroyers from miles away. The German plan was simple. The Hipper would draw the British escort away, and then the Lützow would slide in among the merchant ships and massacre them with her 11-inch guns. It was a classic pincer movement. Defending the convoy was a meager force of 6 destroyers led by Captain Robert Sherbrooke in the HMS Onslow. Sherbrooke knew he was outgunned. He knew that if he engaged the Hipper, his ship would likely be destroyed. But he also knew the new doctrine: there would be no scattering. When the Hipper emerged from the gloom and opened fire, Sherbrooke didn't turn away. He turned toward the German giant. He laid a smokescreen to hide the merchant ships and charged the heavy cruiser. It was a David and Goliath fight. The Hipper's massive shells smashed into the Onslow. Sherbrooke was severely wounded, blinded in one eye with a chunk of shrapnel in his face. His ship was burning, but he refused to leave the bridge. He continued to issue orders, maneuvering his tiny destroyers to threaten the Hipper with torpedoes. The aggression of the British destroyers confused the German admiral. He assumed that for destroyers to be this aggressive, they must have battleships backing them up just over the horizon. He hesitated. Meanwhile, the Lützow approached the merchant ships, but because of the smoke and the disciplined formation of the convoy, the German captain couldn't get a clear firing solution. He feared hitting his own ships in the darkness. The fighting-through tactic held. The British destroyers sacrificed themselves to buy time, and then the trap snapped shut. 2 British light cruisers, HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica, having been alerted by the flashes of gunfire, arrived on the scene and opened fire on the Germans. The German fleet, fearful of losing their capital ships, turned and fled. Not a single merchant ship was lost. Captain Sherbrooke was awarded the Victoria Cross. But the real victory was strategic. The German High Command was humiliated. Hitler was so enraged by the failure of his heavy surface ships to destroy a convoy defended only by destroyers that he ordered the entire surface fleet to be scrapped and their guns used as coastal batteries. Admiral Raeder resigned in protest, and Admiral Dönitz eventually convinced Hitler to save the ships, but they never regained their confidence. The blockade was cracked.
But it wasn't broken yet. The Tirpitz was still out there, and the German battleship Scharnhorst was prowling. The climax of the Arctic campaign, the moment that truly signaled the end of the German surface threat, came 1 year later, in December 1943, at the Battle of the North Cape. The German battleship Scharnhorst, known as the Lucky Ship, sorted to attack convoy JW-55B. The German plan was the same as always: use superior speed and firepower to smash the convoy. But the British were ready. They were reading the Enigma codes. They knew the Scharnhorst was coming before the German captain did. Admiral Bruce Fraser, aboard the battleship HMS Duke of York, set a trap. He used the convoy as bait. He allowed the Scharnhorst to approach the convoy where it was engaged by the escorting cruisers. As the Scharnhorst turned away to escape back to Norway, Fraser cut off her retreat. In the blind darkness of the Arctic winter, fought entirely by radar, the Duke of York opened fire. Her 14-inch shells smashed into the German battleship. The Lucky Ship was torn apart. She was hit by torpedoes from the destroyers and shells from the battleship. Of her crew of nearly 2,000 men, only 36 survived the freezing water. The Scharnhorst sank into the black depths, taking the German surface navy's ambition with her. With the Scharnhorst gone, and the Tirpitz later crippled by midget submarines and Lancaster bombers, the surface threat was extinguished. The route was open. The supplies poured in. The numbers are staggering. Over the course of the war, 78 convoys sailed to Russia. 1,400 merchant ships made the journey. They delivered 7,000 aircraft, more than the entire Luftwaffe force during the Battle of Britain. 5,000 tanks, enough to equip dozens of armored divisions. 4,000 anti-tank guns. 4 million tons of cargo.
They delivered vital raw materials like aluminum, copper, and rubber, materials the Soviet Union had lost access to. They delivered millions of pairs of boots, without which the Red Army would have been fighting barefoot in the snow. They delivered the Studebaker trucks that mechanized the Soviet advance. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev later admitted in his memoirs, "Without these supplies, we would not have been able to prosecute the war." But the cost was biblical. The Royal Navy lost 16 warships fighting to protect the convoys. The Merchant Navy, civilians, remember, not soldiers, lost 85 ships. Over 3,000 sailors died in the freezing waters of the Barents Sea. The horror of the Arctic run was unique. Survivors described the sound of a ship breaking up in the ice as a scream, like metal being tortured. They described the sensation of the oil from a sunken tanker coating the water, preventing men from swimming while the oil caught fire on the surface, forcing men to choose between drowning or burning. There is a famous story of a British sailor who was pulled from the water after his ship was torpedoed. He was covered in freezing oil, half dead, his limbs rigid with cold. As they dragged him onto the deck of the rescue ship, he looked up at the officer, his teeth chattering, and asked, "Is breakfast ready yet, sir?" It was a grim humor born of absolute fatalism. The significance of the Arctic convoys goes beyond the tonnage. It was the physical link that held the Big Three alliance together. It was the proof that the Western Allies were committed to the destruction of Hitler even before D-Day. Without the Arctic route, the Soviet Union might have sought a separate peace with Germany in 1942, as they had in World War I. If that had happened, the full weight of the Wehrmacht would have turned west and the invasion of Normandy would have been impossible. The map of Europe
would look very different today. The tactic that broke the blockade was not a piece of technology, but a piece of psychology. It was the decision to stand and fight, the decision to stop scattering. The fighting through doctrine turned the convoy from a collection of victims into a porcupine of steel. It forced the U-boats to dive. It forced the Luftwaffe to fly higher, and it forced the German surface fleet to stay in port, rusting away in fear. The men who sailed the Arctic route were civilians, shopkeepers, clerks, and laborers before the war. They sailed into the most hostile environment on Earth, facing the most advanced war machine in history. They had no armor plating. They had no heavy guns. Their defense was the convoy. Their weapon was the cargo. Today, the Arctic Ocean is quiet. The ice packs are receding. But if you go to the bottom of the Barents Sea, scattered across the ocean floor lie the rusting hulls of Liberty ships, tankers, and destroyers. They are the monuments to the tactic that saved the world. They're the steel bones of the bridge that carried victory to the Eastern Front. The sailors called it certain death. History calls it the lifeline of liberty. And it proves that in the calculus of war, the most dangerous weapon isn't always the one that shoots. Sometimes it's the one that delivers. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the war, hit that subscribe button. Click on this to watch our next video. You don't want to miss it. This is the World War II Archives.